What if I told you some men feel more alive the day she stops calling their name? At exactly 6 a.m., he opened the same wooden-framed window facing east. The hinges creaked gently, like an old violin string touched only once each morning. Cold light spilled in, quiet and slow, folding itself across the wooden floor, over the kitchen table, into the steam curling up from a black ceramic mug. There were no footsteps coming down the hall. No sound of water running. No second toothbrush. Just the pine trees standing still beyond the porch, and the hum of something invisible settling into the silence. Nicholas, 70, had grown used to this quiet. Not as a loss, but as a kind of quiet companion that never asks anything in return. The cabin sat where the woods began to thin. One bedroom. One stove. A small desk turned toward the light. A worn-out chair where the wood had grayed from years of soft morning sun. On that desk lay a leather notebook and a fountain pen that still worked if you held it just right. The letters inside had no names on the envelopes. They were never meant to be sent. Just small truths he wrote down on cold mornings, sometimes folded, sometimes left open to dry. The mailman didn't knock anymore. He simply left seed catalogs and the occasional newspaper, and turned his truck around without a sound. They called him the man at the edge of the forest. But Nicholas never thought of himself as a man left behind. He had coffee. He had light. He had hours that were truly his. Every morning, he poured boiling water with his left hand, because the right one had never healed properly after a life of carpentry. That hand had once built doors and beds and shelves for people who no longer remembered. Now, it held only enough strength to steady a teacup. It was enough. He didn't need someone to call his name anymore. The sun still found him. The wind still moved across the grass. The truth was, he no longer needed to be witnessed to feel real. There was a time when Nicholas wasn't alone. When the house had two coats by the door. One heavy, one light. When shoes lay in pairs and the television spoke louder than the rain. He had been someone's husband. Someone's father. Someone counted on to fix the leaking faucet, to change the light bulbs, to remember birthdays. He had always remembered. But even then, there had been a quiet ache behind his ribs, like a violin tuned too tight, never played, just waiting. Back then, mornings began with a voice from the hallway. Can you take the trash out? Can you grab milk on the way home? Love, perhaps. Or duty dressed as love. They had a shared calendar. Coordinated holidays. Coordinated silences. He mowed the lawn every Sunday at 4:30. She folded the laundry with the precision of someone trying not to feel. The towels were warm. The dinners cooked. Their daughter called once a week. How are things? She'd ask. The usual, he'd reply. A good man. A reliable man. But never a free one. He used to wake before everyone else, not because of discipline but because sleep never lasted long. He'd sit at the kitchen table with the paper, reading headlines he would forget by noon. The dog would stir. The coffee would brew. Behind him, the hallway door would open. He would hear the shuffle of slippers, the clink of dishes being put away just a little too hard. And he'd smile. Because that's what you do when your life is already written in someone else's script. They had friends. Dinner parties. Birthdays with candles and polite laughter. But the real conversations happened in his head. He remembered standing at the grill one July afternoon, flipping steaks while everyone laughed behind him. The smell of smoke. The weight of tongs in his hand. The sound of people he loved and yet could not reach. He had spoken the way men are taught to speak, useful, short, steady. Not because he lacked depth, but because depth was not welcomed. When he cried, he did it in the garage. With the radio on. Holding a wrench just to pretend it had a purpose. They say love is about giving. He gave. He worked extra hours. Fixed what was broken. Stayed even when he didn't recognize the man in the mirror anymore. There had been nights when he stood at the sink, looking at a single glass left over from dinner, wondering when the conversation had stopped needing his voice. The kitchen lights stayed on later and later. She would go to bed first. He would wander through the quiet like a guest overstaying. They never fought. But sometimes, that silence was more cruel than words could ever be. And he stayed, long after he had nothing left to offer except his presence. Because men like him believed leaving was failure. That the absence of love was not a reason. That as long as the roof held and the bills were paid, it was enough. It was only later, years later, when he found himself sitting in that same chair, but alone, that he realized he had lived with someone for decades without ever truly being seen. And worse, without ever seeing himself. Nicholas had always been the man who knew what time to start the car in winter, who remembered to refill the propane before storms, who brought in the groceries, even when no one asked. There were entire seasons of his life defined by errands, oil changes, tax papers, buying the right batteries. He had a drawer full of instruction manuals, half of them for appliances they no longer owned. And still, he kept them, just in case. He used to think usefulness was love, that being dependable would make him indispensable. But slowly, the gratitude had vanished. Or maybe it had never truly existed. It had just been routine, dressed up in polite nods. He remembers a winter when she was sick. He cooked for her, cleaned up quietly, even held her hair back when the nausea came. She didn't say thank you. But he didn't expect it. He told himself that's what love was, doing, even when it's not noticed. Especially then. That winter passed. She recovered. But something between them didn't. Like a wire stretched too far, the tension never returned to softness. After that, they spoke more in gestures than in sentences. They touched like people remembering how, not feeling it. On Sundays, he took long walks just to feel the wind on his face. Sometimes he didn't tell anyone where he went. Just left a note. Back soon. But no one ever asked what he saw on those walks. The colors of the leaves. The way puddles reflected sky after rain. No one ever asked what was in his mind. They only asked what was for dinner. Or if he remembered to pick up the dry cleaning. His thoughts grew quieter with time, folded into silence like clothes into drawers. There was a day, he recalled, when he found himself standing at the washing machine, holding one of his own socks. A small hole near the toe. He sat down, needle and thread in hand, and began to sew. Not because anyone told him to, but because no one would. It was a strange comfort, this small act of repair. Of mending something no one else would ever see. He began to fix more things that way. A chair leg, the radio dial, a frayed curtain hem. All the things time had worn down, he tended to with a kind of quiet devotion. Not to prove he was still needed, but to remind himself he still existed. He never complained. That wasn't his language. Instead, he waited. For a moment of softness. For a hand to reach without being asked. But that moment rarely came. Most days ended with him sitting in the garage, the light overhead humming faintly, dust circling like slow dancers in the air. He would close his eyes and listen to nothing. And in that nothing, he sometimes felt more honest than any word he had spoken all day. By then, the marriage had become a routine with no ceremony. A rhythm with no music. He once heard her laughing on the phone, light, warm, effortless, and realized it had been years since he'd heard that sound directed at him. Not out of cruelty, just absence. The kind that grows slowly, like ivy across a wall, until everything underneath is hidden. And so he stayed. Because that's what men like him do. Not out of cowardice, but out of a promise they made to themselves when they were young. That love meant holding on, even if it meant being invisible. Even if it meant slowly disappearing behind the life they built for someone else. The day she left was not loud. There were no slammed doors, no broken plates, no screaming. Just the soft sound of a suitcase being zipped. Twice. She didn't look angry, only tired. tired in the way people look after packing up a version of their lives that didn't turn out how they'd hoped. She stood in the kitchen doorway, holding her coat. "You'll be fine," she said, like a nurse changing shifts. He didn't answer. He didn't know what to say to a statement that was both an end and an accusation. The house felt bigger the moment she was gone. Not emptier, just wider, like space had been released from where it had been quietly compressed. The air moved differently. Even the clock ticked louder. He didn't cry that day. He made coffee. The same way he always did. Poured it slow. Sat at the table. Stared at the steam as it rose and vanished. Something in him had already been leaving for years. Her absence was only the last step of something that had long been walking out the side door in silence. That night, he didn't turn on the television, or the radio, or any lights beyond the one over the stove. The refrigerator hummed like a distant voice trying to comfort him in a language he had forgotten. He stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark yard, watching the trees shift without knowing why it moved him. It was just wind. But that wind felt personal. He slept on the couch, not out of grief, but because the bedroom felt too formal for just one body. The blanket smelled like the old dog they used to have. He pulled it over his chest and closed his eyes. He didn't dream. The next morning, he made toast. Not because he was hungry, but because it was something to do with his hands. He ate standing up. The jam he opened had a layer of dust on the lid. He liked that. It meant time had passed. That not everything was about to begin again. People didn't ask much. A few neighbors waved more slowly. Someone dropped off a casserole. He said thank you. He didn't eat it. He didn't want to eat anything that came with pity. What he wanted, what he didn't yet know how to name, was silence. But not the cold silence of two people not speaking. He wanted the kind of silence that listens back. He began writing letters he would never send. To her. To himself. To no one in particular. At first, they were only a sentence or two. Then longer. He kept them in a drawer next to the old radio. Sometimes, late at night, he would take one out, read it under the small lamp, and nod. Not with regret, but with recognition. The silence didn't crush him. It didn't echo. It just was. Present. Unapologetic. It filled the house the way music might, if music were made of wind and breath, and the creak of floorboards under slow, deliberate footsteps. In the weeks that followed, Nicholas found himself noticing sounds he hadn't heard in years. The way the heating pipes clicked late at night. The groan of the floor under his own weight. The soft brushing of pine needles across the roof when the wind changed direction. He didn't speak much, not even to himself. Words felt heavy and unnecessary. He no longer had anyone to explain things to. There was no one to misunderstand him. And in that strange absence, something within him began to breathe again. At first, he mistook it for grief. The ache that came while washing a single plate. The heaviness of folding one towel, not two. He'd pause in the middle of simple tasks, staring at nothing, letting the silence settle like dust on his skin. He thought he was breaking. But he wasn't. He was unfolding. There were evenings when he didn't bother with dinner. A piece of bread. Some olives. A few sips of wine he drank slowly, like a ritual for someone recently buried. He didn't feel hungry, and for the first time, he didn't mistake that as a problem. Hunger, like noise, had always been something he responded to for others. Now, it could come and go. He wasn't trying to survive anyone else's expectations anymore. He went days without turning on the television. The voices inside it were too fast, too confident. They filled the room with a certainty that no longer matched the life he was living. So instead, he listened to the hum of the refrigerator, to the birds in the early morning, to the way wind tapped gently at the windows like someone asking permission to enter. Sometimes, he sat in the hallway for no reason at all. Not the porch. Not the couch. Just the hallway, where the light from the front door stretched long and golden across the floorboards. He would sit with his back against the wall, knees bent, hands resting on his lap, and just wait. Not for anything in particular. Just to feel what was real. The stillness. The quiet. The honesty of not pretending to be okay for someone else's comfort. One night, he found himself in front of the mirror. He hadn't really looked in weeks. Not deeply. The man looking back at him had more gray than he remembered. Softer eyes. He didn't look lonely. He looked unburdened. That surprised him. He didn't miss her. He missed the idea of being needed. But even that was beginning to unravel. The freedom of not being anyone's solution was terrifying, but also holy. He started to write more. Not memories. Not stories. Just sentences that felt true. Today the wind smelled like cinnamon. I miss laughter, but not the jokes. I am not broken. I am just finally quiet. These pages didn't need structure. They didn't need audience. They were not for healing. They were for witnessing. And that was enough. There were no plans to start over. No list of goals. No reinventing. Nicholas didn't want to be a better man. He just wanted to be an honest one. And in that intention, something small but powerful began to return. His own company. He didn't fill the silence anymore. He let it live beside him. And in that space, where once there had been conversation, correction, compromise, there was now only breath, and the occasional sound of a bird outside, reminding him that not all songs need words. There was a Tuesday. He remembered it not for any specific event, but because nothing happened at all. He woke without an alarm. The sky was gray, clouded but soft. No rain. Just the kind of light that doesn't demand attention. He sat at the edge of his bed, hands on his knees, listening. No phone calls. No obligations. Just the steady hush of his own breathing and the distant rustle of branches outside. He made oatmeal, stirred it slowly, ate it by the window, watched a bird land on the porch railing, tilt its head, and fly away again. That moment, unremarkable to anyone else, lingered inside him for hours. Something about the way the bird didn't hesitate. It came, it paused, it left. Nothing was forced. Nothing was explained. That afternoon he swept the porch. Not because it needed it, but because he wanted to see the wood beneath the fallen pine needles. There was comfort in the motion, in making space, not for someone to visit, but for light, for air, for himself. The broom moved with quiet grace. He noticed the way dust lifted, hovered, then settled again. He didn't hurry. There was no one waiting. Later, he sat down with a cup of tea, held it in both hands. The warmth pressed gently into his palms. He thought of all the times he had rushed, through meals, through conversations, through days, always trying to arrive somewhere. Now, there was nowhere to arrive but here. The loneliness didn't come as a storm. It came as a question whispered late at night. Are you still here? And every time, he answered without words. Yes, I'm still here. Not because anyone asked, but because the stillness asked nothing of him except truth. One night, he lit a candle for no reason. He placed it on the table and sat in front of it, watching the flame dance like it was remembering something ancient. The light flickered across his hands, his face, the pages of his notebook. It was enough. The act of lighting it felt sacred, though no one was watching. He began to notice patterns. How the light shifted across the floor depending on the time of day. How the birds came in pairs and then alone. How the wind returned, always from the west, just before sunset. His life became a series of gentle observations, nothing loud, but all of it real. Sometimes he would whisper things into the room. Not prayers. Not confessions. Just small acknowledgments. That was a good apple. I like the sound of this chair. The rain smells different tonight. He wasn't speaking to anyone. Or maybe he was speaking to the house, and the house was finally listening. He didn't miss the noise. Not anymore. Noise had been a mask. A way to avoid hearing the truth underneath. But now, in the quiet, he could hear the full sentence of his life. Not just the parts others had written. There was no epiphany. No sudden transformation. Just a slow unraveling of what wasn't real, and the soft return of what was. It didn't look like joy. It looked like breath. Like a man waking up not to do something, but simply to be. There came a night when the power went out. No warning. Just darkness, sudden and complete. Nicholas didn't panic. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The refrigerator stopped humming. The heater went quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. He walked slowly to the drawer where the matches were kept. Struck one. Lit the candle he had used so often now. It felt like a familiar voice. The room bloomed into golden shadows. The walls softened. The chair took on the shape of something known, not owned. He sat, the flame steady beside him. He wasn't thinking of anyone. Not her. Not his daughter. Not old friends who no longer called. He wasn't thinking of time, or endings, or who he had once hoped to be. He just sat, breathing in the stillness like it was oxygen. And in that flickering hush, something shifted. It was not joy. It was not sorrow. It was the feeling of arriving, not somewhere new, but somewhere long forgotten. The center of himself. The part that had waited through years of noise and effort and polite silence, through dinners and meetings and mowing lawns and fixing gutters. That part of him had not spoken for years. But now, it didn't need to. It was enough just to be felt. Later, after the power returned, he didn't turn on any lights. He stayed in the candlelight, letting it stretch across the ceiling in soft, unsteady shapes. It reminded him of firelight on camping trips as a boy, before the world had told him who to be. Back when silence was still magic, not punishment. Back when aloneness meant possibility, not failure. He wrote one sentence that night: "This isn't loneliness. It's a return." Then he closed the notebook and left it open on the table. Not to be read. Just to be there. Like the rest of him. Unhidden. From that point on, his days were not filled, but opened. There was no need to organize them, no need to make them useful. He took long walks with no destination. He touched tree bark. He smelled the earth after rain. He stood in streams and watched the current fold around his ankles. He made breakfast when the sun was already high, and sometimes he forgot to eat dinner. Sometimes, he whispered her name. Not out of longing, but as a form of honoring. She had been a chapter. But he was still the book. There were no resolutions. No healing arc. No moment where he declared himself new. There was only time and breath, and the quiet rhythm of one man living without the need to be seen, without the ache to be needed, without the script he had once tried so hard to follow. He no longer filled the space. He shared it, with the trees, with the birds, with the wind and the dust and the sunlight that changed its mind every hour. And in that quiet, the truth he never dared say out loud became clear. Some men do not fall apart when she leaves. Some men begin. Nicholas didn't try to become someone else. He didn't sign up for classes. He didn't read books on reinvention. He didn't join hiking clubs or force himself into cheerful rooms. What he did, instead, was fix the back door. The hinge had been sticking for years. He sanded the edges, oiled the frame, sat with it open for a while, just to hear the wind move through the space it had once resisted. It wasn't about productivity. It was about presence. He cleaned the gutters, repaired the bird feeder, sharpened the knives. Each act small, almost invisible, but with a kind of tenderness that wasn't there before. Not because someone might notice, but because he had finally remembered how to notice. He began keeping a bowl of lemons on the kitchen counter. He didn't know why. They reminded him of mornings when things had been simpler. When the sun coming through the window was enough to make a moment feel full. When he peeled one, the scent stayed on his fingers for hours, and he liked that. He didn't wash it off. One afternoon, he found an old jazz record in the attic. Something they used to play in the background while cooking. He dusted it off, placed it on the player, sat down and listened, not as nostalgia, but as now. The notes hung in the air like they'd been waiting for him. Not every song brought peace. Some stung, but he let them play anyway. Healing didn't mean avoiding the ache. It meant not flinching when it arrived. He planted something, lavender, in the front yard. Not to impress the neighbors. Not even to use. Just because he wanted to see it bloom. To witness something grow without explanation. His days formed a quiet rhythm. Wake. Breathe. Open the window. Notice. Not seek. Just notice. A new bird on the fence. The way steam curled off the mug. The soft shift of the house settling into itself at night. He no longer chased meaning. He trusted it would arrive in its own time, or not at all. He still had hard days. Moments when the silence pressed too tightly against his ribs. But those moments didn't frighten him anymore. He let them sit beside him like old friends who had run out of things to say. He didn't try to fix them. He simply didn't send them away. And slowly, the house began to feel less like a container of what was gone, and more like a cradle for what still remained. Nicholas began to enjoy the ritual of sweeping the same stretch of wooden floor each morning. The way the dust gathered in corners, how it moved reluctantly under the broom, as if it, too, was tired of being displaced. He never hurried. He wasn't cleaning for guests. He was tending to his space the way one tends to a wound, not because it bleeds, but because it matters. In the afternoons, he'd sit on the porch with a book. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he just held it. The point wasn't in the words. It was in being still enough for a leaf to land on his knee without startling. The pages would flutter in the wind like wings, and he liked to think the book was breathing too. He started keeping water in a blue ceramic jug. Left it on the counter, room temperature, always half full. He liked the way the light caught in it around 3 p.m., casting gentle shapes onto the wall. That light would move slowly, inch by inch, until it disappeared into evening. And he'd watch it, quietly, like someone listening to the end of a lullaby they hadn't heard since childhood. Sometimes he spoke aloud, not to anyone, just into the space. He might say, "That's enough for today," or "Well done, old man," or "Still here." It wasn't loneliness. It was acknowledgement that a man could live a life unseen and still be deeply alive within it. He fixed the old wooden stool in the shed, the one with the cracked leg, not because he needed it, but because it had waited so long to be whole again. The process was slow. A little glue, a clamp, time. He didn't check the clock. The stool didn't ask for speed, only presence. And when he sat on it the next day and it held him without a creak, he smiled, not with pride, but with kinship. One evening, he watched the stars come out without counting them. He used to trace constellations to feel oriented. Now, he let them be scattered. Messy. Free. Like the story of his own life, no longer needing tidy meaning to feel complete. He no longer wondered what others thought of him, whether the world still had a name for men like him. He didn't belong to anyone. Not to schedules. Not to dreams that had long since dried. But he belonged, deeply, to this quiet life. This handmade rhythm of small acts that no one would notice but him. And in that, something sacred unfolded. A kind of reverence for the slow, the ordinary, the unremarked. Where breath was enough. Where being was not a task. Where no applause ever came, and none was needed. On a rainy Thursday, Nicholas spent the entire morning repairing the loose drawer in the kitchen. It stuck each time he tried to open it, made a sound like something resisting memory. He removed it carefully, sanded the edges smooth, tightened the rails. When it slid back in with a clean, satisfying hush, he exhaled. It was not a project. It was a conversation, with time, with usefulness, with himself. He began listening to the rain without needing to describe it. Not soft, not heavy, just rain, moving across the roof like fingers tapping on a drum. Some mornings he would leave the door open, just slightly, to hear it better. The smell of wet earth, the cold in the doorway, the sound of nothing rushing, all of it made him feel less like he was alone, and more like he was part of something that didn't require his name. He didn't speak to many people anymore. The neighbors waved. The postman nodded. Sometimes the woman at the feed store asked how his hands were holding up. He would say, "Good enough," and smile. That was the truth. He didn't long for deep talks. Just these small acknowledgments that he still existed in someone else's periphery. That was more than enough. He started a habit of leaving one lamp on in the evenings, not because he was afraid of the dark, but because he liked the way it touched the walls. The light didn't reach far, just a circle on the floor, but it felt alive. And sometimes he would sit in that pool of light, feet bare, hands resting on his knees, and listen to nothing, to everything. He realized quietly that peace doesn't come with arrival. It comes with release, not with fixing yourself, but with no longer needing to be fixed. The garden didn't bloom for anyone else's eyes. The books he read didn't make him better. They just reminded him he was still here, still curious, still capable of wonder. And on some nights, when the sky was very clear, and the wind paused just long enough for stillness to settle, he would whisper a single word into the dark. Enough. Not as a conclusion, not as a resignation, but as a small declaration that this quiet life, unwitnessed, ungilded, unbeautiful to the outside world, was whole. Years passed this way, quietly, without ceremony. The seasons did what they always do, shifted softly. Snow fell, then melted. The garden bloomed, then browned. The birds came, left, returned again. Nothing remarkable, nothing missed. And yet, everything felt deeply, intimately his. Nicholas didn't mark anniversaries anymore. Not of her leaving. Not of old birthdays. He let time flow without gates. Some days he forgot what day it was entirely, and when he remembered, he smiled, because forgetting meant there was nothing to count toward or away from. Only the present remained, and it was always enough. There was a morning, not so long ago, when he stepped out onto the porch barefoot. The boards were cool, the air carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. In his hands, a cup of tea he had steeped without measuring, without timing, just by feel. The steam curled around his fingers like breath. A bird called. He didn't know its name. That didn't matter. He stood there for a long time, watching the light slowly pour through the trees like syrup down bark. And in that moment, he didn't wish for company. He didn't ache for conversation. He didn't want to be anywhere else. He didn't need to be understood. There was no performance left in him, no desire to be more than this. A man, in the quiet, with a heart beating slowly and hands no longer trying to hold too much. He'd been asked, once, if he was lonely, by a young man at the market. Kind eyes, curious voice. Nicholas had just smiled and said, "I used to be, but not anymore." The young man had nodded, as if he understood. But Nicholas knew he didn't. Not yet. Understanding this kind of solitude takes time, takes breaking, takes choosing not to fill the silence with noise just to avoid the echo of your own soul. He wrote one final letter, folded it neatly, tucked it between the pages of his notebook. It wasn't a goodbye, just a sentence. "If love ever returns, I will greet it with both hands open, but I will not chase it." He placed the notebook back in the drawer, not to be found, but to rest. And sometimes, on especially quiet days, he'd hum a tune he didn't remember learning. One his mother might have sung, or maybe one he invented. There were no lyrics. Just sound. A way to say, I'm here, without breaking the silence too much. He no longer needed a woman to feel like a man. No longer needed to feel useful. He had walked through the fire of being forgotten, and come out, not new, but real. And if someone were to find him, years from now, and ask what kind of life he lived, he'd hope they wouldn't read his journals or search for signs of productivity. He'd hope they'd notice the soft worn path to the garden, the perfectly repaired stool, the bowl of lemons, still fresh. He'd hope they'd feel what he felt in the end, that a quiet life, gently lived, is no less magnificent than one written in lights. Because the truth about men who live alone without a woman isn't that they've given up. It's that they've returned to themselves, to the earth beneath their feet, to the breath that belongs only to them, to a kind of wholeness no one else needs to verify. He didn't wait for love. He became it. In the way he lit candles without occasion. In the way he listened to wind. In the way he left room for silence, not as an absence, but as presence. And if you, reading this, watching this, listening now, if you've chosen a similar kind of quiet, if you've stopped apologizing for your solitude, then maybe this is your truth too. A man alone is not a man broken. Sometimes he is simply a man, finally free. If you've ever found peace in your own silence, leave behind a small mark, a dot, a whisper, a sign that you, too, have heard the wind and stayed still.